Hello, students in the Master Woodland Owner course. My name is Matt Russell. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist here in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. And so what are we here to learn today? Well, I'm going to go off to the right here and show you that we're going to be learning about mapping your woods. I'm really talking about some resources and concepts available to you in order to do that with your woods. And so we can dive right in. One of the important things about understanding your woods is understanding and being able to describe the characteristics of your property. And so a lot of documents are really helpful in this. This could be things like the deed to the property, any sort of legal and financial information you might have about the property. These are really important things, particularly if you're thinking about a management plan or you're thinking about some resources to compile to help you to better undergo forest management activities in your woods. Second, is there any history of forest management on your woods? And so understanding what's happened already on your woods, even if you weren't the landowner when some of that management in the forest happened, that could be helpful in terms of guiding future management activities that you might undergo on your property. Also, do you have a management plan? That can spell out a lot of the different kinds of things that we're looking for in terms of information that describes your property. Things like the boundaries of the property, things like the kinds of species and the kind of trees that you have on your property can be really helpful for outlining future management in your woods. Property boundaries are really important to understand in terms of ways to know where your property is relative to some other things and other ownerships nearby. And really important to keep good records. So understanding how we can use these records to help inform future management is really important. So in forestry and in forest management, we use a lot of maps. So there are lots of different kinds of maps that are typically available to us. One of the first kinds of maps are topographic maps. And so lots of folks use these kinds of things to understand where roads are, where waterways are, where trails are. And the good thing about topographic maps is that they provide a lot of detail about the landscape. So not only where those roads and streams and lakes are, but also the changes in elevation as you move from one place to the next. Another kind of map that is commonly used in forestry are plat maps. And so here's an example of one that I have in my office that folks use pretty regularly. And so the good thing about a plat map is it really shows you the different kinds of ownerships in a certain kind of area. So unless it's sort of state forest land or national forest land, it's oftentimes hard to understand who the actual owner is for a certain plot of land. And so the plat maps provide the same kinds of things, the lakes and the rivers and the roads, but also the kinds of ownerships that are available in a certain region. And then we rely on things like online tools such as Google Earth. These are really valuable tools and sort of provides you a good landscape view of, if you understand what's going on in your property, you can see what neighbors are doing and sort of get a broader perspective of what your property looks like relative to others in the area. And we'll be essentially creating our own map of your property within the My Land Plan system. And I'll go through an example of that for a woodland that I chose and that I'm using, and you can do similarly through one of the module activities. When we talk about property information, that's really the key first step in conducting a woodland inventory. And we'll have a lot more about woodland inventories in a future module, but really just to get the point across that understanding things about the property are really important. So things like boundaries. Do you actually know where the boundaries for your land is? Things like historical or cultural resources. These could be things like cemeteries, like burial grounds. If you know of these different kinds of things, you might be keeping those different kinds of resources in mind as you're performing management activities across your woods. At a more detailed level, we can look at different kinds of stand measurements. So this could be the age of the trees across your woods. This could be the stocking of trees. So is your land very highly stocked? That is, there are a lot of big trees, a lot of shade on the forest floor, or is it lightly stocked? Few trees, maybe there's a lot of sun open in the canopy. At an even finer level, we can look at things like tree measurements. So these could be things like diameter, height, tree quality, all of these kind of different tree measurements, which this gentleman on the right is measuring the diameter of a tree. All of these tree measurements can help to better understand the health of our forests and how our forests are growing through time. So I mentioned this term on the last stand, and that is a stand. And so what do we define as a stand? This is a common term that foresters like to use. Well, a stand is a contiguous group of trees with relatively uniform age, composition, and structure. And so you can see as an example here on the right that we have lots of different kinds of stands that make up this individual property. And so the majority of the property is in this number 12, and this actually isn't forest land. So this is designated as cropland and pasture as a part of this property. However, there are lots of other different kinds of forested stands that are a part of this one property. And so as an example, for stand number 1, we're dealing with red and white oak, basswood, sugar maple, 6 to 12 inches in diameter, and maybe it needs some timber stand improvement work. And so that stand is sort of located in this northeast corner of the property. However, there are lots of other kinds of stands. So red and white oak is a common species that's occurring on this property, but there's also pine in terms of white pine plantations and red and white pine plantations. So those can be found in different areas of the property. So just to show you a typical timber stand map and a description of those different kinds of stands that are a part of one property. And to get the point across that these can range in size, ranging from 1 acre to over 100 acres. And so here's an example of 2 clearly marked stands. And so what we have here on the bottom of the slide is what looks like definitely planted trees, and definitely looks like one species. And so you can tell that they're planted because it looks like they're planted in rows. It looks like they're all the same species. However, on the top of the slide, there's a lot of bigger trees, and clearly a different stand than the one on the bottom of the slide. And so here we can think about delineating the stand as sort of where those 2 stands merge. And we can talk about one stand being vastly different from another stand in terms of the species out of there, the age of the stand, and the general composition of the stand. So we have a few activities that we can do as a part of this module. And so first, I encourage you to watch 2 videos that are available on the My Land Plan website. And these 2 videos will talk about how to add a property to your My Land Plan account, and then how to add features and points of interest and some of the more finer level information about your property. So we encourage you to do this. And so that's really the goal of this module, is to add your property to My Land Plan and then see sort of how it looks when you add all that information. And then the last thing is really just to tell us about your woods. So what did you find? Are you able to clearly mark the boundaries of your property? And what about some of the other points of interest that you thought might be worth highlighting as a part of My Land Plan? And so before you do that, I'll show an example of a woodland that I chose to use as a part of My Land Plan. And the woodland that I chose to use is located at the Cloquet Forestry Center in Cloquet, Minnesota, which is found in Carleton County. And that woodland that I chose is actually owned by the University of Minnesota, and we're doing different kinds of management in different stands across the property that we own up in Carleton County. And so I'm going to switch over and we'll take a look at my boundary for my property. So what we have here outlined in blue is my property boundary. This is, as you can see up in the upper left corner, about 52 acres in size. There's a road that traverses right here, the Cloquet Forestry Center, a lot of buildings and barns and things like that over here. So one thing that I've added was the property boundary, which is here, a little over 50 acres in size. We can also take a look at some of the features that I added to my property. And now we can see lots of different things going on here in my property. One thing I thought might be of interest in terms of if we're interested in doing a forest management activity was to locate where the water bodies are. And so what I've outlined here is Otter Creek. And so this is a creek that goes through just to the north of my property, but still something I might want to be concerned about in terms of making sure that I know that creek is there if I want to do some timber harvesting in the area or something like that. You'll see I added a few points to my map. One here on the eastern edge, and the other one on the western edge. What I've outlined here when I've marked on my land plan account is the equipment barn. So I might be interested to know where the equipment barn is relative to the property. And so that's what I've done here. It's just a barn where we store equipment that we'll potentially use for doing different kinds of things on our property. Another one over on the western edge is just a place where I counted or I saw grouse. And so I make a note that I flushed 2 grouse here in October 2015. So maybe that was something that I might want to come back to, or maybe I could potentially take a look for grouse in that area in the future. You also see I added some polygons, and 2 of those are here on the eastern edge of the map. So one here, they're both very similar, but the 2 of them are basically open areas. So they're not forested. There really are no trees growing in that area. And so I've designated those as open areas, and I've labeled them as a feature on my map, just in case I want to think about doing some kind of management in the future in those areas, maybe a replanting of some species that might be appropriate for those sites. Another thing I've done is I've delineated a stand. So that's what you're seeing here in black. That encompasses about half of the property. What I make a note of is that this is an old red pine and jack pine stand. And so if I'm interested in doing something here, this is a very clearly different stand than the rest of my property. And so things that I might do here would be different than I might do on the rest of the property. And so this is an example of just what you could potentially do with your land plan. So you could go in and think about different areas and points of interest to add after you've outlined your property boundary. And so I'll move back to the PowerPoint slides. And that's an example that I used with my woodland and cloquet. Also, if you're interested in getting outside, head out and explore your woods. So we have a couple of optional activities for you to do if you're eager to get outside and try out some of these things and get a better feeling for where your property boundaries are. One of those is just to take a walk in your woods. Locate your property boundaries. You could mark these with various different kinds of things. It could be a fence, could be a rock pile, stakes, or any other means. Also, some folks just clear brush from your property lines to make them more visible and to avoid trespassing when either you, your neighbors, anyone that's working in your woods, could be a logger, could be a forester. Just if you clear brush, that could be a useful way to make your property line more visible as a part of your property as a whole. And so that's it. So good luck in answering these questions and going through the rest of the module and your activity on my land plan. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. My phone number is there, and also my email address is there if you'd like it. And so with that, I'll sign off. Let me know if you have questions, and good luck with the rest of the module.